Okay, hey everybody. Okay, so this is going to be a follow-up to the my last video on whether or not MBTI and personality types and all that is quote unquote scientific. And if it's not, do we really even care? Um, so to wrap up sort of the conclusions of the last video in a nutshell, um, I argue that, there's really no way that, the scientific community, let's say, is going to accept that the MBTI or personality types or cognitive functions, all that kind of stuff is quote unquote scientific in the sense that it meets the exacting standards of, a scientifically valid, provable hypothesis, testable, falsifiable claims, all that kind of stuff that makes something quote unquote scientific. In the bottom line, whether or not it's objectively true, independent of any sort of actor or observer. And the argument is, you got, the person being typed, you have the person typing them or the system that was developed by somebody that's typing them. And then you have just the general community at large that all have their own little biases and they're all making their own independent evaluations. And my argument is you're just never going to find any sort of, testing method or approach that is going to be independent of all of those observers, right? They're all going, there's no way to just take them out of the equation and figure out what somebody's personality type is if they're just a brain sitting in a jar somewhere and measuring electrical activity or something like that. Like it's never going to happen. And so you're always going to have the problem of the observers, either the person being tested, the person doing the testing, or just everybody else, deciding whether or not they agree with the results of the testing. That's always going to be an issue. But it doesn't matter because it's probably true for the vast majority of things that we think of as true or think of as things that we know to be true. And some examples I gave are things like, the law, right? The various laws and regulations and legislation and rules that we all sort of agree to live by as a community or as a society. And nobody can say, whether or not a speed limit or a no loitering ordinance or, a law against robbery or theft or embezzlement or, you name it, whether or not that's like objectively true that people should or should not be doing those sorts of things. But because it's all going to be dependent on the observers, on the people in the society, on the people who are making the rules. And again, there's not going to be any sort of objective way of testing that meets what people mean when they talk about scientifically valid and scientifically, um, true conclusions, right? That are independent of an observer. But that's fine. Like, we still live in a society where we all know the rules and generally, tend to abide by them. And also understand that there's exceptions to the rules, and the rules are largely based on context, and it's based off of, what your society is and all that. And not necessarily trying to say that, that there's, or like try to argue in favor of moral relativism or anything. That's a whole other debate. But the point being that there's just no way to scientifically test whether or not a speed limit is like the objectively true speed limit, right? We just sort of come up with what we think is the best answer given the context. And then the other way to think about it is just sort of market forces, right? If you think of the stock market and you think of, what's the value per share of a share of Apple stock. Now you can Google it, and it will give you a dollar price. And if you wanted to buy a share of Apple stock, you're probably going to pay around that price to buy it. But is that objectively true? What the actual value of a share of Apple is? Is there a way to scientifically prove it? No. And we understand that, and we've understood that for a long time as a society. And what we do is we just sort of allow market forces to decide, right? Because even though there are people out there in the various business schools and hedge funds and stuff like that who will try to tell you that there is an objective way of figuring out whether or not what the price of a given stock is, and whether or not the listed price is overvalued or undervalued. you know Maybe, there's some people who might be good at that, but there's still no objectively true way of measuring that. It's all dependent on their assumptions, baked into their formula. And then not only that, but the actual price is going to be based off of a lot, millions and millions of factors. You have millions and millions of transactions going on every day. And some of them are, based off of people. Some of them are algorithms that people have developed. Some of them it's based off of the news. Some of it's based off of just how the market's doing in general. I could sit here all day and rattle off a million things that will determine a stock price at any given moment, right? So, so as a collective group, we've all decided that the best way to figure out, quote unquote, the price is just to let the market decide, supply and demand. How many buyers do you have? How many sellers do you have? And what are they willing to sell it for? Same for housing prices, same for any sort of market, right? Where you have a bunch of buyers and a bunch of sellers sort of establishing the market price. So what does this have to do with personality? Excuse me, getting a cough here. It's because the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lots of things that we quote unquote know or we take to be true and generally agree upon as a community, but there's no way to objectively prove it through any sort of scientific method. Even though there's a lot of people who think that there might be, there just isn't. And in a lot of ways, it's just sort of a fool's task to, keep trying to come up with some scientific methodology that's going to meet the exacting standards of physics or mathematics or whatever. And I know math isn't really science; it's a totally different discipline, but you know what I'm saying. Anyways, okay. So another way to think about it, and I'm going to get to some practical information here in a second, but another thing that occurred to me, another way to think about it, is we're actually in a very different time right now, which is pretty exciting. And I don't think a lot of people sort of have realized this or articulated it. But, for, 100 years or so, we've largely relied on the scientific method, which is basically somebody comes up with a hypothesis and then you test it using various scientific methods, double blind kind of tests. And you have something that you can measure that either, supports the claim or falsifies the claim, right? And and if you really dig deep into it, every scientist will tell you you never really know anything to be true. You just know that it hasn't been falsified yet. And that's, really what the scientists will tell you. And so now you think about the Amazons and the Netflix of the world, and they have sort of a problem that they want to solve of, how can they predict whether a given consumer will buy a product or not, or watch a TV show on Netflix. Let's just use Netflix as an example. And you could think of it as trying to apply the scientific method to it, and you could say, okay, for you have some Einstein in the marketing department or development department, and Einstein sits in his or her office and comes up with the hypothesis, right? That I think, males between 45 and 65 are going to like Westerns or historical dramas and, more likely Westerns. And so let's test that theory, So we're going to take all of our customers that are watching Netflix and find the ones that are 45 between 65. This is why they have you sign in on your individual profile so they know who's watching. And we could basically say, we'll give somebody will watch a movie and then we'll give a recommendation right after the movie's over, right? And for half of them, we'll give them a recommendation that's like a Western, okay? And for the other half of these guys who are between 45 and 65, we'll give them some random recommendation, right? Like it could be Barbie or it could be, some romantic comedy, something like that, right? It's just you give it to them in random, right? Now, if the hypothesis is true or not falsified, most 45 between 65-year-old people, males, will pick the Western, right? And ignore the random one that was generated, okay? And not only that, but they'll pick the Western, they're more likely to keep watching as opposed to just turning off the TV and going and doing something else, okay? So that's a very scientific way of testing it. But that's very time consuming. It takes a lot of time to build any data, very resource intensive. And so what they figured out in the sort of big data community is, let's just watch their behavior. Let's just watch what they pick, right? And generate sort of a predictive algorithm based off of that. So rather than trying to test them and use them as sort of quote unquote guinea pigs, let's just watch their behavior and then have algorithms that sort of learn based off of what their behavior is, right? And and it might be true that, some people might pick a Western after watching one Western, but maybe they're sick of Westerns and maybe they want to move on to something else. And so the big data algorithm will sort of learn that stuff, right? And that's been sort of a relatively new development. And it's not scientific in the sense that they're testing some hypothesis. They're just letting the data speak for itself. And they're basically saying, look, I can tell you more about this person than the Einstein sitting in the, back room coming up with all these theories and testable hypotheses, right? So what we're starting to see is more people are starting to accept that lots of data and market forces, right? Like what generates the price of the Apple stock is actually more reliable and more quote unquote true than some sort of scientific method, right? And so in the personality community, finally getting to that, that's really what we're seeing. And I think it's a pretty interesting phenomenon that you basically have thousands of people out there who are have a general sense about hey, there's these different personality types, and whenever I interact with this person they seem to be different than that person. What's going on? And we have and then we have this general framework that we can work with, the either the MBTI or socionics or cognitive function models that might be a little different. And we can sort of use market forces to figure out sort of the best description of what an ESTJ is or what an ISTJ is or what introverted thinking is versus extroverted thinking, right? We don't have to have Einstein sitting in some office figuring out a testable hypothesis and then testing it over and over again, using various people as guinea pigs. What we've got are just a lot of competing ideas that are out there competing in the marketplace of ideas, right? And some people make really good arguments and have really good observations. Other people maybe not so much, maybe myself included. But we as members of the community who sort of want to figure out what an ISTJ is or what an INFP is, will take all of that data and just sort of maybe, decide on our own conclusions and maybe try to convince people otherwise, right? Or, clarify or find some nuance and do the tinkering and the fine tuning. And, the community sort of at large decides whether or not it agrees, right? And so there's sort of this emergent phenomenon that comes out about what an ESTJ is, or what an ISTJ is, or whether Brad Pitt is an ISTP or a ENTP, things like that. And that's all part of the fun, right? And that is what I mean by, this is all just sort of discourse, right? There's not going to be any sort of God or alien that comes down and tells us, okay, here is the exact way to test whether somebody is an ESTJ or figure out if they're an ESTJ. And Brad Pitt is definitely an INFP or ISFP or whatever, nobody's going to do that, right? And so the only way that there's going to be any sort of, consensus, to the extent there is any, is just going to be this competing market force of ideas. Okay. So if you're getting into MBTI and you're getting into personality types, or if you've been doing it for a while and you're just sort of spinning your wheels trying to figure out all this stuff, that might be a way to think about it. Where, there's certainly are going to be some people that are just, their description of it, their model is just going to click with you. It's going to make sense. But there might be some nuance, or there might be something off or something inconsistent with it that your TI is sort of sorting out, and sort of doing sort of a logic check on it. And you might go to another channel and they have a slightly different way of describing it, right? Like, I like to watch a lot of INFPs out there. INFPs are really good at sort of describing this type of stuff, but they do it in a very different way than like, an ENTP on Talking with Famous People might, right? He does it in a very analytical way, and I tend to agree with it, and it makes a lot of sense to me, and it helps me sort of tinker, the way I think about things. But then sometimes I want a very different approach, and I might just watch an INFP talk about it, or maybe an ENFP, and they have more of sort of a kind of a way of describing it that's not as analytical, but more sort of like story based, right? Like they describe it with a lot of examples and a lot of stories, where it resonates in a different way, right? And so I would say the first thing, any sort of recommendation that I'm making here, this is not intended to be like self-help guru stuff, but just, general recommendations, general education, is, try to get as many different perspectives, especially coming from different types, because you'll get a little bit of a nuance from one type that you might not get from another. And so spread your attention around. Don't just like hold on to one person, if you want sort of a broader, more nuanced understanding of this stuff. The other thing to think about is, even if you can't scientifically prove whether or not you're an INFP or an INTJ or whatever, the conflict is, you can still narrow it down, or you can still find a way to think about it that, even though there's no exacting formula out there, there's enough big data, there's enough in the marketplace of ideas, there's enough blog posts, there's enough, internet chat rooms, and I don't know, I'm using like old terms, I know, but you know what I'm saying, YouTube channels, TikToks, all that kind of stuff, where you can get a lot of different sort of angles on it. And then also, keep in mind, like, sort of what the whole point of doing it is, right? And that's really what I want to focus on now. And to me, there's sort of 3 or 4 reasons to get into this stuff. And none of them completely depend on anything being scientifically true or not. The first one, the first reason would be just to understand that um, that there are different personality types, just period, right? Just the general, baseline assumption that there are different personality types and they tend to cluster in particular ways. Um, because once you've sort of gotten to that point and you at least acknowledge that there are different personality types, might be hard to figure out which is which, but you know that there's something out there and there's these different clustering of groups in society or in the world. You're like 50% of the way there, right? It's like knowing is half the battle. And because what it allows you to do is understand that you have to approach any situation where you're dealing with other people you have to approach it where you're able to look at it from their perspective. Okay. And the vast majority of people in the world have a really hard time seeing things from other people's perspectives. And I was watching some video. There's a former CIA agent out there that I think has a book or something. And he's sort of making his rounds on the internet, podcast network. And he's got like big poofy hair. You've probably seen a couple of videos if you're into like personality and psychology and stuff. He pops up all the time. And I saw this interview with him and he made a real interesting point. And the person interviewing asked, like, what's like the most fundamental, most needed, most required skill to be a CIA agent? And the guy's answer was, you have to be able to see situations from somebody else's perspective, right? Like if you're interviewing somebody or trying to recruit somebody to work for you, all that kind of stuff, like you have to understand his perspective and not just your own perspective. Like, if you're trying to recruit a spy or something, right? You can't just go and like try to make the argument that he should be working for you based off of your perspective and what you want out of the situation. You have to look at it from what he wants out of the situation and what he's going to get out of it from his perspective. And any good negotiator, and this is, I mean, even if you're not in the CIA, anybody who, works in the business community or in a large organization, especially if you have to negotiate things, I mean, that is like rule number 1. Like you have to be able to see things from the other side's perspective or you get nowhere, right? And so just by simply understanding that people have different personalities, even if you can't necessarily read exactly what they are, you at least understand that they might be looking at the situation in a different way than you are, right? And so not only do you have to put yourself in their perspective, you almost have to put yourself in their personality, right? Like what do they care about? Or are they sort of a more of a lead TE type of person where they just want like an efficient, practical answer to whatever the problem is? Or are they maybe more of a lead FI person where they want an explanation for why it's good for them and the organization and everybody else and sort of building, not necessarily the moral answer, but at least, giving them something where they understand that there's a preference, right? That there's sort of this FI preference that they might have. Or if you're dealing with somebody who might be more of a, INTJ, or no, sorry, like an INTP or an ISTP, like lead introverted thinker, they might want to drill down on, like, the solution you're giving, and does it really match up with, the wording of the contract or the wording of the regulation, all that kind of stuff. They might want to drill down a little bit more, and you have to understand, like, okay, that's their perspective. That's the problem they're trying to solve in their head. And just knowing that, that you're sort of aspiring to get to a point where you can do that somewhat effortlessly. And trust me, I've been, we've all been doing this for years, and I don't think anybody does it just without any effort. But at least knowing that that's the framework that you should be approaching the problem. Because, just in dealing with the business world, dealing with, various people over the years, I would definitely say the people who are, the most successful in any business at any position are the people who understand the other person's perspective, right? And I know there's this one lawyer that I work with every once in a while, and I've told him, I was just like, anytime you're on a phone call, I want to be on the phone call with you, right? Like, you know, whether it's necessary, and I won't bill my time, but I just like watching him interact with people because he's so good at understanding where the other person's coming from, right? And he's probably like an ESFJ, really good lead FE, really is good at reading people. And I don't know if he knows any of this MBTI stuff, personality stuff, but it just comes natural to him. And it's fascinating to watch, and he's very, very successful because of it, right? And so as you're sort of, developing and working your way up through the workforce, you want to find those people. You want to find the people who understand other people's perspective. Mm-hmm. And once you're looking for it, you'll see it. You'll see it right away. Okay. So that's the first thing that you should be getting out of this. And again, it doesn't matter if the person's an INTP or an ISTJ. Like, you'll just sort of get a sense, of what they feel is important. And so use that and work with that. And okay, so that's probably, to me, the most important thing about learning all this stuff, or having some sort of base knowledge about it. Second thing, and I think it's probably what most people sort of get into the stuff for, is just sort of the self-knowledge stuff, right? And again, I'm not trying to be a self-help guru or anything like that, so take this as purely educational. But understanding what your type is very helpful in sort of in development sense, but maybe in a different way than what you're used to hearing. So you kind of have to go back to what Jung's original point of all this stuff was. And like I've said in other videos, he was a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst, right? And he just noticed that there seemed to be these different personality types or psychological types that would come in for treatment or, some sort of therapy session. And if they were of a certain psychological type, they tended to have certain types of, mental neuroses or problems that they were dealing with, challenges, however we describe it these days. And, and he would see that, extroverted thinking types tended to sort of over focus on and fixate on outside world objects. And then they would start having anxiety and dreams and neuroses about FI type of things, right? Where, that the FI was being ignored because of the hyperfixation on the TE stuff. And so it just sort of bubble up and cause, problems with dreams and neuroses and stuff. And if somebody was fixated on the FE stuff, they would tend to have neuroses that was sort of TI based, right? So if you read through the original psychological types literature, you'll see some examples of it. And it's pretty interesting. He talks about people being obsessed with the object and developing alcoholism and stuff because they're just so obsessed with, and not only like alcoholism, but like they're obsessed with like the bottle, right? Or they're obsessed with like an insurmountable mountain, that they can't get over, that kind of thing. So very Jungian, very just sort of woo-woo metaphysical stuff, but you get his point. And I think the larger point here, and this is number 2 of what to get out of all this stuff, is to understand that all of these cognitive functions are playing checks and balances with each other. Okay. And the biggest check and balance, just like how, different government systems like legislation or branches, legislation, executive, judicial, they all do their own thing, but they also check the other system or, the other branches, right? So that nothing gets like out of hand. Think of the cognitive function sort of working like that, right? So if you're an INFJ, you're going to have this dominant introverted intuition, and that's just going to be your baseline. Just when you wake up, that's what's running. When you go to sleep, that's what's running. When you're driving in your car, that's what's running. And it's just sort of your baseline, okay? But it can get out of hand, right? It can really get out of hand. Like I talked about in the Dracula video where, he sort of obsessed for hundreds of years over this one person who represented love to him, right? And it, made him into a literal monster. And so the SE is a function that checks that, right? It checks the, your NI from running haywire. Okay. And so if you're an INFJ or maybe an INTJ, the biggest sort of check and balance system that you have is NI going berserk and then SE sort of punching you in the face with reality, right? And one of the biggest challenges that introverted intuition dominant types, INFJ, INTJ, are going to have is building up these representations of sort of idealized versions of people or relationships, or an idealized concept of what this job is going to be or living in this city is going to be. And it's not really an anything. It's like like you use the NE to sort of build up the NI, and then the NI gets so strong, right? And so prevalent and robust in your brain. And remember, NI is tied to that part of the brain that tells you that you know what you know. And so you just have this like overwhelming sense that you're right about it, right? So, for example, you're thinking of, moving to a different city and you learn everything you can about the city. And, let's say Boston or something. You want to move to Boston, you learn everything about Boston and you're reading up on all the history and looking at all the different areas, and you might even take a trip or two there, and you build up this representation in your head, and you just like, oh, Boston's going to be so great. And then you move to Boston and you're there for a few months and it doesn't match your, idealized representation of it, because that SE is now starting to read the actual reality of the situation. And you sort of get punched in the face and you're just like, wait, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. This isn't my beautiful home. This isn't my beautiful wife. That kind of thing. And you're sort of faced with, reality showing you that your introverted intuition was maybe not wrong, but a little bit off. Okay. Or maybe not completely, telling the complete story. And so that's your check and balance as an INFJ or INTJ. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like develop your SE and become like a holistic person or anything like that. I mean, maybe there's something to it. I don't know. But it's just understanding that you've got this NI that can run like a runaway train, and eventually the SE is going to show you the reality, right? And then also just, building up this representation and then actually doing something about it, right? Like actually, pulling the trigger and moving to Boston is a very SE thing too, right? And so just getting over the inertia of just sort of sitting there and idealizing about it and never doing anything about it. SE is sort of that aspirational goal. And again, you have to sort of realize that it's very easy to fall into the NI trap, the little comfy couch that we think of as NI, where we don't have to expose ourselves to the reality. We can just live with this comfortable representation in our head and, just and be comfortable knowing that there's hope out there. But then actually pulling the trigger and doing something about it, takes some effort. So that's sort of the check and balance there. I mean, I could go through all the different types, I'll give a couple of examples, but, but the more you think about it, the more you'll sort of realize how this all plays out, so like, let's take like an INTP, for example, right? So they've got lead introverted thinking and their fourth function is extroverted feeling. And so my sister's an INTP, and I'm going to give examples like she's like a supercharged INTP. And so and again, you think of the fourth function as being sort of this aspirational function where it's something that we like, you want to be using, and you're constantly thinking, oh yeah, someday I'm going to get around to using that. Or, developing it or being good at it or whatever. But, but you rely on sort of the comfy home of your dominant function. So an INTP is going to have this sort of aspirational, wanting to sort of fit in with the crowd, wanting to maybe not so much fit in, but sort of be appreciated by the crowd and like, what they have to offer to people. But they've got this like lead introverted thinking. And so they just have, I'm thinking of my sister here, right? And she's my representation of the INTP, but, and so because they want people to sort of appreciate their TI, basically how smart they are, they tend to put it out there a lot. and and maybe sometimes at inappropriate times, right? And so you need the FE, that sort of reading the social dynamic and sort of understanding the room and that kind of thing, to play a check on that TI sometimes, right? The example I always use is like, if somebody asks me, hey, where's the nearest gas station? I'd be like, oh, it's like 5 blocks down the road, down, such and such road. And my INTP sister would be the first one to be like, well, really, it's 7 blocks. It's like, okay. Right? But like, they can't help themselves from that like extra precision, right? That's why we all love the INTPs, because they keep us honest. But just sort of blurting that out and like correcting people's grammar, stuff like that. It has these sort of weird social implications, right? Now they think they're being helpful, right? And that's sort of the irony of it, right? That I just told this poor person that the gas station's 5 blocks down the road, but they need to know that it's really 7, right? So she's trying to be helpful, right, by correcting the information, but not really thinking of like the practicality of it. Well, if they drive 5 blocks, they're and the gas station's not there, it's not like they're just going to stop and give up, right? They'll probably just keep going and they'll get to it, right? So, anyways, and so the FE is supposed to sort of, put that TI a little bit in check, because sometimes to sort of groove with the social situation, um, and the sort of social dynamics, it doesn't require exacting precision, right? FE is a lot of people like to think of TE as being like the practical function, like figuring out a practical solution, but and it is. But FE is also very practical. Like, how do you deal with people in a very practical way, right? Um, and TI is not practical at all. TI is very precise, right? And something either is or it is not, right? Valid or not valid, logical or not logical. And there is no sort of like, hand waving, like maybe it's okay. Okay, so enough about that. But point being is if you're an INTP, you sort of need to realize, okay, I got this great functioning TI and it's going to, do a lot of good for me in a lot of situations, but I have to keep it in check and sort of think of the practical solutions, or the practicalities of the situation when dealing in social settings, that kind of stuff. Okay. Um, all right. And another example, and this is just the classic example, is the lead extroverted thinkers, the ENTJs and ESTJs. They are the classic Shakespearean tragic characters, right? The tragic kings that had all this TE, building their empire, building their kingdom, defeating their enemies, figuring out how to win the war. Think Napoleon, think somewhat Julius Caesar, think Richard III. Just these tragic kings, or emperors or rulers, whatever you want to call them. And then they lose sight of that FI, and they lose their family, sort of like Walter White, Breaking Bad, who ended up in ENTJ at the end. It's the same thing. Like, he was so focused on building his empire and defeating his enemies that he lost track of his family, right? Like the FI stuff that mattered to him. And that FI is supposed to keep that TE stuff in check, right? And not only that, but just losing your sense of morality of like, I'm going to build this empire, or I'm going to build this organization, just this business, right? And I have like 5 employees working for me. But I'm just going to, work them to death and be this taskmaster and expect all this sort of TE, results, and losing sight of the FI, and what sort of matters for the organization, what sort of I don't want to say like the moral way of running it, but what's sort of the socially ethical, acceptable way, and again, not in an FE kind of like, let's make everybody happy kind of thing, but like, just understanding whether what you're doing, to your employees or your customers or your family or to your community at large, what sort of effect is that having on them in sort of a moral, ethical sense, right? And that's the tragic case. And it's the people who have this like dominating TE. And of course, TE sort of feeds on itself and it rewards itself. And you're making more and more, and your empire is getting bigger and bigger, and your business is getting bigger and bigger and better, and if you don't have that FI sort of playing in check, that can spiral out of control. And I've said before, I've worked with a lot of ESTJs, the business community, and the really good ones have like a pretty solid FI, right? Where, they're trying to do what's best for the business, or trying to make money just like everybody else, but they're not going to cut corners. They're not going to, do shady things. Like they're going to like play by the book, because that FI is keeping that TE in check, right? And, the really good ESTJ leaders out there understand that. Okay. So the importance, I think, of, learning your type or figuring it out is understanding what's your big trade-off, right? Or what's your big check and balance that you need in your life. Um, and and if you think you're an INFP and you're really an INFJ or vice versa, that might throw you off a little, right? Because you might be thinking, oh, I'm an INFJ, and so I got to worry about, my introverted intuition staying in check with reality, when really that's not a problem for you, right? Or at least not a problem as big of a problem as it is for the INFJs. Your sort of issue, or thing to work on, or thing to pay attention to, would be more of a FI versus TE thing. Like, you know, it's sort of the opposite of the ESTJ tragic figure. It's also sort of understanding that, okay, sometimes, businesses do have to operate to make money, right? And sometimes you do have to show up at work at 9 o'clock, to get the job done, and stay until 6 or stay until 7, or, maybe stay late sometimes to get that TE stuff done, even though your FI really doesn't want to do it, right? And I hate to, it just makes me think of that viral video that was going around on TikTok with the poor kid from Starbucks who was crying about having to work, 5 hours or something. And then, like, all the Gen X people are just like, what? 5 hours? Like, I wish I could work 5 hours. And so, classic case of FI sort of running out of control, and not thinking about the TE part of it. Like, hey, maybe your employer needs you to be doing this. And if it's not really going to jive with your FI, then, maybe think of another job. Um, but if you need the job, and, for whatever reason, and you can't find another one, and you need the money, then maybe you need to check your FI a little, right? And just let that TE part of you go, and understand, the process. So the INFPs and the ISFPs out there, that's sort of your check and balance system. And you can apply basically the same formula to all the types. And I'm happy to sort of do a separate video on that if you want. Go and watch my Sense of Dread one, and I'm sort of doing that, but in a different context. The Halloween, one of the Halloween ones. Okay. So that's the second thing, is just sort of understanding your balance, right? Like, Jung was all about balance. Jung, like, his entire philosophy boils down to one word, and that's balance, right? If your chi is off balance, right? If you got too much TE going and not enough FI, and that stuff gets off balance, then it has sort of, drastic effects on your psyche, right? At least, that's his argument. And I can't say he's wrong. So using it just, that sense. And so, yeah, you probably need a pretty good idea, at least what your dominant function is. But if you're an INFP versus an ISFP, whatever. Um, okay. So that's, and so you do want some level of precision. And again, I'm always promoting this, and I don't get paid for it. But if you really want as precise of an answer, go to Talking with Famous People and get a session with him. Now, is he always right? I don't know. Seems to be right a lot of the time. And, so, give it a try. If you're sort of wondering what your type is, and sort of vacillating between 2 or 3 different ones, because I realize how annoying that can be. But also think about, like, hey, if I really just sort of step back and looked at myself objectively, what's the biggest imbalance in my life, right? Not necessarily like, what are you bad at or what are you good at, but just where's the imbalance? I mean, do I tend to, ignore the TE stuff in favor of the FI stuff, and it sort of causes me issues because of it? That sort of stuff. Okay. Third point. So third point is really, getting into it and really just sort of contributing to the overall community, right? I mean, like I said, this is by and large a battle of ideas, a marketplace of ideas. And I think, again, we are in a very different time as a culture. We've sort of entered into a new phase where the scientific method is always going to have its place, but we spent hundreds of years trying to apply it to everything in our life, right? They try to apply it to economics, they try to apply it to the law, they try to apply it to psychology, they try to apply it to everything, right? And every time they do it, it sort of falls short just philosophically because you couldn't separate the measurements from the observer, okay, is usually the problem. But we are, as sort of a culture, whether we know it or not, moving into this sort of new acceptance or this new way of knowing things. And that's that big data kind of thing. And we've always had it like in the stock market and in the housing market. But we always just sort of thought of those as markets and they're sort of their own thing. But now it's becoming, it's driving the algorithms that are, making recommendations on Netflix and Amazon and just marketing in general. It's no longer, finding focus groups and doing all these like scientific tests on them and double blind studies or whether they like this toothpaste versus that toothpaste. Like that stuff doesn't apply. It's too expensive, it's too time consuming, and it's not as exacting as they want you to think it is. Instead, just use the data. We got all the data out there. Let's just build these algorithms that can predict behavior based off of that. Is it perfect? No. But is it better than all these double blind research group studies? Probably, and probably by a lot. And so we're getting comfortable as a society or as a culture of, relying on that data, on like big, on algorithmic data or like the output that we get and as being quote unquote true or representative of, what a customer likes versus what they don't like. And accepting it, in the business community and just the community at large. And to me, I find it really exciting. Like I like that idea of complexity and emergent forces and market forces and all that. And I think it explains a lot more than what the scientific method can do, because it just lets things unfold in a way that the scientific method cannot do. Because you need controlled experiments and double blind studies and all that kind of stuff. And, it's just impossible for, lots of different domains and areas and even AI, right? So, for years, they were trying to develop AI in this way that was sort of like a TI logic formula. If this, then that, if this, then that, if this, then that, and trying to build up knowledge that way. But now with like chat GPT and generative AI, it's all probability based. It's like, if I say the wizard held up his, and, there's going to be a probability that, 80% of the time it's the wizard held up his wand, or 15% of the time the wizard held up his hand, that kind of thing. And it sort of generates an answer or a response based off of probabilities. And it's not doing double blind testing or any sort of scientifically valid testing. It's just using the data out there and letting the data speak for itself on sort of these probabilities, right? Now there are people that are sort of testing the AI models of, how accurate they are, or whether or not, what they produce makes any sense. And so there is some sort of human sort of feedback going on. But eventually the AI models are going to figure that stuff out too and self-evaluate. And so, I mean, we really, like within the past year or so, have entered into this whole new way of thinking about what's true and what is sort of reliable information. What can we rely on? And so if you're really into the MBTI stuff, right, and it's more than just trying to figure out how to read people, or trying to figure out what your type is and figuring out your balance and all that. You know, make contributions, right? No matter what your type is, right? Make contributions, because all of that stuff adds up. It really does. And, you know, and it could be comments to a YouTube video, it could be making your own channel itself, you know, whatever. And it could be as much or as little as you want it to be. Um, but, you know, sort of get yourself out there into the market of ideas and understand that even though there's a lot of like people who think, you know, that they're right about all this stuff and like to shoot people down, don't worry about them, right? Like they don't know any more than you do, right? Or at least they're, you know, I don't know. I don't know if I should put it that way. There are people who know a lot, but um, either ignore them, because most likely the people who are going to pipe up and sort of, you know, be sort of the troll or the bully, those are the people who don't know what they're talking about. The people who do know what they're talking about, they'll be more constructive and they'll be more helpful, in my experience. Um, and so, you know, if you say TI is one thing and they think TI is another thing, you know, they might be a little bit more constructive, but your contribution still helps, right? Because there might be somebody else out there who's thinking the same thing, and there might be a way of fine tuning what you're thinking, right? And somebody's sort of doing a Google search or watching videos or something, and they'll come across that information. And again, it's just this marketplace of ideas that's trying to resolve through discourse what all this stuff is, and the more you can contribute, you know, the better. um you know, on big channels and small channels and all that. Okay. So that's the third thing, is just sort of, you know, having as many people contribute to the marketplace of ideas as possible. And then the fourth thing is, you know, maybe a little bit more idiosyncratic, might not apply to everybody, but there's so, to me, I think there's a benefit of it just from sort of a media consumption, like watching movies, reading stories, reading books, um, telling stories, telling jokes, watching comedians, just understanding different personality types just sort of gives all that stuff more meaning, right? Like when you're watching Star Wars and you can sort of pick up on the types that Skywalker is probably an INFP, and he's got this lead introverted feeling that's going to give him a sense of moral purpose and conviction. And he, you know, he's facing this big TE, you know, Goliath monster of a empire, right? The big galactic empire is a big TE machine, right? And it's a big TE machine where society has lost its sense of humanity, right? And little Luke Skywalker, you know, living on the sand farm or whatever, um, with his sense of FI, can sort of give back some sense of humanity to this overall galactic empire, right? Or at least defeat it, right? And then bring humanity back to, you know, the government, or, you know, but then you also, you know, and you can sort of dissect it in other things where, like, you know, other characters like Han Solo is probably an ESTP. And what are ESTPs polar at? They're polar at FI, right? So um, he didn't really care, right? In the way that Luke Skywalker did. He didn't, you know, he was just sort of out for himself. And so he didn't have no FI, right? He had a little bit of FI, but it was very sort of childish and immature and undeveloped, right? And so he was just out for himself and what he wanted. And he didn't really care about society at large, right? But through the course of the series, you know, he developed that FI, you know, sort of sense, right? That sort of sense of morality. But he always sort of had that little, you know, smug bastard way about him where he'd sort of lose the FI. But that was sort of his arc, right? And when you watch all these different stories, I would argue you just sort of get more out of it, because you can see how the different functions are manifesting themselves not only in the characters but also in the storyline, right? And especially if like you're an aspiring writer and you want to like write your own stories or your own screenplays, like if you can tap into this archetype stuff, and have not only the characters have a type but like the environment has its own type, right? Because in the way that the Galactic Empire was this TE machine that had no humanity, no FI, um, you'll come up with stories that just resonate, right? Because all of this cognitive function stuff from Jung is just his a manifestation of the archetypes, right? um and we have all these archetypes sitting in our collective unconscious, and that's what stories do, is they sort of make them bubble up to the surface, and we see how they interact with each other and how they're sort of diametrically opposed to each other, and how again, in the Star Wars sense, you have to sort of bring some balance to the universe. You can't have too much TE, you can't have too much FI, except for the last three where it was just all just an FI fest, but whatever. But and this is not just me like coming up with my own little theory about it. I mean, George Lucas like studied Jung and like the archetypes, and he studied Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, and the hero with the thousand faces, that book. He's said publicly that a lot of Star Wars was sort of based off of that philosophy, the hero's journey philosophy. And and now that Hollywood has sort of sniffed that out, you've got Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and all pretty much every Disney movie before year 2010 or so was some sort of hero's journey type of story, or at least a lot of them are, maybe not all of them. All you INTPs out there, don't correct me on that. Okay, and so that's the other thing, is just really just sort of the fun of it, and getting just getting more out of things, getting more out of stories and what they mean, and also being able to sort of talk about them and interact with people on sort of a deeper level when it comes to that kind of stuff. All you INFJs out there, I know you're already doing it, but the other types, that's something to think about. So to me, that's really the big four. I mean, the first two I think are the biggest, figuring out perspective of other people. And again, it doesn't matter if you can nail down their type, as long as you're sort of in the general temperament, right? Are they an SJ? Are they a SP? Are they NF? Are they NT? That gets you pretty much 85% of the way there, right? Now, if you figure out that they're an NF and you can't figure out if they're an ENFP or versus INFJ, don't worry about it, right? But just understand that they've got a perspective that they're coming from, and the more you can sort of visualize yourself in their perspective, the better. You'll be very successful in really any line of work. And then the other thing, just figuring out that check and balance system in your psyche, not letting NI just run off like a runaway train, and using some SE to check it, right? And it takes a while. Like I will be the first to tell you, man. Like you get so enamored with your NI, right? And so enamored with the fact that you thought of something that nobody else thought of. And then you get tested on that theory, whether or not you're right or wrong, and the SE reality hits you in the face, and you're just like, ooh, well, maybe I need to fine tune my little NI theory, or maybe I need to keep it to myself. Like over the course of time, you'll have enough of those sort of gut checks, and that's all about developing it, right? Like listening to your quote unquote listening to your SE, and not letting your NI go haywire. And it's true for all the other types, whatever your dominant function is. Okay. So I think that's really about it. Hopefully you got something out of it. Feel free to leave a comment. Love to hear from everybody and have a good weekend. Talk to you soon. Bye.